We must not, under any circumstances, drag the state of Israel into new elections, into its fifth election. Establish a stable government now.
Talks with potential partners have already begun as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears short of victory in the latest Israeli election. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The results of the latest Israeli election point to yet another stalemate. Preliminary results show Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's potential right-wing alliance 2 seats short of the 61 needed to form a coalition government. There's much at stake for the country's longtime leader, whose trial on corruption charges is set to begin next month. CGTN's Stephanie Freed has more from Tel Aviv.
As Israel's vote counters wrap up tallies in the country's 4th general election in 2 years, front-running blocs are nearly tied. Neither side has the majority needed to form a government coalition. The two sides in this election, a right-wing and religious party pro-Benjamin Netanyahu bloc versus assorted left, center, and right-wing parties looking to unseat Israel's longest-serving prime minister. To make up the 61-seat majority needed to form a government coalition, party heads are negotiating with potential coalition partners. It boils down to tentative bargaining for alliance in exchange for key positions and future policy implementation. Benjamin Netanyahu is in a precarious position and has been since he was indicted on corruption charges last year. By law, he is barred from serving as a parliament member while under indictment, but that law doesn't apply to a sitting prime minister. Netanyahu is trying to hang on to the prime ministership, and there's broad speculation that if he is able to form Israel's next government, he'll seek implementation of legislation granting him immunity in the cases he goes on trial for in early April. Some major changes introduced to the country's parliament in this latest round of voting: entry of an openly racist extremist right-wing group that's an offshoot of an outlawed party branded as terrorist in the 1990s. Arrival on the scene of a breakaway Islamist party whose leader could hold a key to coalition building if either of the two opposing blocs agrees to partner with his party. And revitalization of the left-wing Labour Party, led by Israel's only female party leader. Vote counting continues on Wednesday. Final results are expected to be in by the weekend. Stephanie Freed, CGTN, Tel Aviv.
There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Ruthie Blum is a columnist for the Jewish News Syndicate and Jerusalem Post. Jafar Farah is a Palestinian rights advocate and the head of the Mossawa Center in Israel. And Amotz Asa-El is a senior commentator with the Jerusalem Post, and that's who we'll start with. Amotz, amazing. 4th general election in just 2 years. You supported Yesh Atid party leader Yair Lapid. You wrote this about him: he embodies the moral impartiality, mental balance, and personal humility that Benjamin Netanyahu abandoned while leading us to moral meltdown and political limbo, rather. So what does this election say about Netanyahu and his opposition? No one's really had an effective campaign to push him off the world stage. He is seen by some as just this force of nature with this unbelievable, uncanny ability to just kind of hold on to power. What does this election say about him and about his opposition?
Well, on the one hand, he has impressed even his opponents in the way that he confronted the pandemic. And in this regard, his conduct was the inversion of Donald Trump's frivolous attitude for which he was punished by his own voters in the United States. Netanyahu's attitude has been the exact opposite of that. He took the pandemic extremely seriously from the onset and seized control of it personally, shedding aside other elected officials and even professional executives, ultimately leading by himself the great effort to get the vaccinations, which worked perfectly, and Israel therefore emerged from the pandemic apparently ahead of other states worldwide. And this impressed the public deeply, especially because the lockdown that has affected the economy so severely and the broad middle class and many other layers. And all of them were deeply impressed with this. They personally felt an improvement from a very dire situation, and they attributed all that to him, and some of them also prized him for this at the ballots. However, the critical mass of his opponents remained intact and, in fact, even slightly grew. And this means that, in my analysis, he has exhausted the electoral pool off of which he's been living for the past dozen years as prime minister, and particularly for the past 2 years of repeated elections.
Well, Ruthie, he took the pandemic seriously. He obviously is going to take this situation seriously. This is familiar terrain for him. Where does he go for these remaining seats that he needs to get to 61?
Well, first of all, we have to wait till Friday at least, because there are some 500,000 votes that haven't been counted in a country this size. That's a lot of votes. And because of the way the system works, the votes that come in could change. It's not just that they might add to Netanyahu's power, but all these votes, if they help one party, they hurt another party. It's at the expense of a different party. And that's what we don't know right now. The other factor that's questionable here is Naftali Bennett's Yamina party. Though Yamina is ideologically aligned with Netanyahu's Likud party, Naftali Bennett and Netanyahu are both personal enemies and political rivals. Now, though Naftali Bennett is polling in a single-digit number, he still believes, for some reason, that he could be prime minister by cobbling together a coalition of anti-Netanyahu parties in the center, because Yamina is a right-wing party, not a left-wing party. I think he's fantasizing, and if he changes his mind or he goes back on his vow that he won't sit under Netanyahu, then Netanyahu does have a chance of forming a coalition, even in the current situation, and especially if Netanyahu goes back on his own promise not to rely on the Ra'am Arab party for support.
Jafar, Ruthie makes a really good point that we still have some votes to count. So then what we're really dealing with right now is hypotheticals. But one of the interesting hypotheticals is Mansour Abbas, the leader of the United Arab List Party. He says he's not ruling out the possibility of joining Likud and Netanyahu. Obviously, that would not be a preference of Likud, but it's obviously more preferential than having a fifth election. So talk to us about how this might be viewed, this alliance, in the Arab community.
I don't think Netanyahu will include Mansour Abbas and the United Arab List in his government. He will offer Mansour Abbas some benefits, social economic issues, housing issues, fight against crime in the Arab community, but not sit around the government table. What he will try to do is to use the conversation or the negotiation with Mansour Abbas to push the right-wing parties, to force the right-wing parties to lower their expectations and their demands from his government. Actually, Netanyahu have a majority with right-wing parties. I think also you have to take in consideration that Gideon Sa'ar and his party with 4 or 5 seats, he's willing to join. In the end of the day, you don't have another option. The opposition of Netanyahu don't have 61 seats either. So in the end of the day, what is expected is that Netanyahu will try to negotiate with Mansour Abbas, but will not offer him a seat around the table, the government table, but he will try to convince the other extreme right-wing parties like Naftali Bennett and also Gideon Sa'ar to join his coalition. Yair Lapid, actually, with 18 seats with his party, he is not relevant as a candidate for prime minister, even if all parties, all opposition parties will support Yair Lapid in the end because of political issues, the occupation, the two-state solution, other ideological issues. It will be very hard for Naftali Bennett and other right-wing parties to join actually government with Yair Lapid. So they will be forced, in the end of the day, it will be long negotiation, and but Netanyahu will offer them some benefits and some also positions around in the government as Prime Minister or the Minister of Justice, which is like one of the demands of Naftali Bennett is actually to control the Ministry of Justice and to implement policy changes in the Justice Ministry. So I think in the end of the day, the United Arab List will get some benefits, but will not be part of Netanyahu government.
Amotz, it's so interesting because everything seems so messy today. And again, you know, it's a really an important point to make that Ruthie did, that we still got some votes that need to be counted. But this election was framed as such an important one as far as democracy, so much at stake. And then when you look at the number, that this kind of appeal that there's an urgent need to really kind of you know, straighten up the political system, and yet you look at the turnout, it's lowest since 2013 at just 67%. Is this just a matter of election fatigue?
It is a matter of election fatigue, but it is also, I think, an implicit vote of no confidence in the entire political spectrum, the way it has been functioning in recent years. And this is food for thought for all of Israel's politicians. On the happier side, I must say, as a middle-aged citizen of this country, that the very emergence now of a legitimate possibility that an Arab coalition partner will be there legitimately, that's unprecedented in Israel's political history and can have some very far-reaching implications and positive ones. I would say more than that, that the Israeli Arab voter has made a very emphatic statement in this election. That voter faced a choice between the veteran configuration that represented him and her in Israel's parliament and this new configuration that Mansour Abbas presented, which was much more pragmatic in its attitude towards Jewish Israel. And I think that the fact that nearly 1 in 2 Israeli Arab voters opted for this new and novel and a contrarian attitude is actually a very positive sign.
Ruthie, I see you shaking your head. So you agree?
I totally agree with what Amotz said, even though Amotz and I are not in the same, we didn't vote for the same party. I totally agree with him. And Mansour Abbas, here's the irony. He is the head of an Islamist party, and yet what he decided to do, pragmatically, as Amotz said, is tackle the actual issues within the Arab-Israeli sector. And there are serious issues among them, or maybe foremost among them, incredible violence, both domestic violence and street violence. There's lots of murders, gang wars, every kind of shooting. And what Mansour Abbas did is something revolutionary and really wonderful, actually. What he said is, we have to stop spending all our political energy on fighting for the Palestinians and start worrying about ourselves within the Jewish state, within the state of Israel. We're citizens of Israel, and we need a place at the table in order to exact change. If Netanyahu, it also is ironic that if somehow Mansour Abbas does get some kind of place at the table, maybe a Knesset committee, something like that, if that's true, it will be ironic that a Netanyahu-led government did that, as opposed to a left-wing government. Or maybe it makes sense, because if a left-wing government were in power and tried to do that, the right would fight it. So maybe it actually makes sense. Now, we still don't know if Netanyahu is going to lead the government, but as I've been writing in the weeks leading up to this election, the way the map is right now, it's either a Netanyahu-led government or another election.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, though, is Reuters reported just a couple of days ago that somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 people were outside Benjamin Netanyahu's house. One of them with a bullhorn saying, "Bibi, go home." Apparently he has no intention of going home. I mean, he's been serving consecutive terms since 2009, also served a term in the 90s. But the last 4 elections have been a struggle to hold power. How do you explain both his longevity and the difficulty he's faced in recent elections, Ruthie?
Well, first of all, I explain his longevity as a factor of his being an incredibly great statesman. Everyone likes to say that he's a magician politician and he knows how to pull rabbits out of his hat. But he's also a great statesman. And I have to say, even a member of the Labour Party told me yesterday that in internal meetings in Labour, they said, our problem is not our ideology, our problem is that we don't have a Netanyahu among us. And that's a fact. It is not an accident that Netanyahu has been prime minister for 12 years straight and 3 years on another stint, 10 years before that. It's not just because he knows how to build a coalition. It is because he gets things done. And the vaccine campaign, which he did, I mean, the CEO of Pfizer said that Netanyahu harassed him day and night, not to mention paying double for the vaccines in order to get them. But Netanyahu also signed the Abraham Accords. Let's not forget about that. These are huge developments. And by the way, one of the reasons that the Palestinian issue was not front and center during this campaign, aside from the coronavirus, which really was the main issue on everyone's mind, but one of the reasons is because of the Abraham Accords. Netanyahu has said throughout his career that he can make peace with the Arab world, and it's not dependent on whether Israel and the Palestinians, whether the Palestinians have a state or Israel and the Palestinians resolve their issues.
Jafar, Netanyahu did talk to his supporters last night. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We must and we can bring more historic peace agreements with Arab countries. A peace for peace, and not peace for the uprooting of tens of thousands of Jews from settlements that will not result in peace.
Now, the Arab community appears divided in Israel. Turnout was low. We've already talked about the turnout being low. What's your read on what he had to say and the turnout issue?
Look, Netanyahu actually is offering the region one-state solution. He's not offering two-state solution. He's not offering peace for the Palestinians. He's offering normalization with some Arab countries without peace with the Palestinians. And the challenge of the Jewish Israelis is actually how to live with the Palestinians. It can be in one-state solution, but without apartheid regime. It can be a one-state solution with one man, one woman, one vote. This is not the offer of Netanyahu. He fall in love with this settlements, project, occupation, and etc., which cost the Israelis a lot of money. Now, people in Israel are tired. The opposition to Netanyahu is big. Actually, more than half of the Israelis don't want to see Netanyahu, but they can't translate their political will. The whole demonstrations that have been mentioned by you and etc., it haven't been translated to political will, mainly because of the failure of Netanyahu's opposition. You know, a year ago, we had Benny Gantz as the main candidate against Netanyahu, and he get a lot of support, almost the same seats as Netanyahu's party. But day after the election, Benny Gantz joined Netanyahu's government, and now the public is very angry and frustrated, and they didn't support actually Netanyahu's opposition. The challenge in Israel is actually the demographic balance. There is in Israel ethnic voting, very strong ethnic voting. Every community, actually, they vote in a way that they think that it's important for their community. So there is ethnic voting in Israel that actually created the situation that we are somehow in a balance of fear between the two camps. Still, if you ask and you look at deep research that have been done in the last few years, you see that there is a lot of frustration from Netanyahu's policies, the corruption issues, but there is no alternative. That's the main challenge, that the alternative to Netanyahu is very bad, and it's on vision issue, and it's also on the organizational issue. On vision issue, they don't offer anything when it comes to peace, to social issues, economic issues, multiculturalism in Israel. So they don't have any offer for the Jewish public, and they can't compete. And when they did that a year ago, day after, General Benny Gantz, he took a decision to join Netanyahu again and to secure his government for another year. So the challenge in Israel actually ethnic voting and what Israel is about for the next 20 years. Where is Israel is heading in the next 20 years? That's the main issue here. And people, you know, in the Arab community and also in the Jewish community, they are frustrated. And that's why less and less people also took a decision to go and vote actually in the election day.
Amotz, the Palestinian Prime Minister weighed in on this election before the votes actually started to occur. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We consider these elections an internal Israeli affair. All their electoral campaigns were at the expense of our land and our people, and parties are competing over more land, more settlements. We condemn these frenzied campaigns against our lands, our sacred sites, and our people, and we call upon the world to intervene to stop these measures.
Amotz, it seems like a never-ending cycle. The International Middle East Quartet, made up of the European Union, the Russian Federation, the U.S., and the UN, they met on Tuesday. They're seeking to return to meaningful negotiations for a solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict. What do you make of all of this?
I think it's a lot of hot air. Breakthrough between Israel and the Palestinians will only come from within and not from without. There is no magic formula whereby some external power or a combination of external powers will come and rearrange the Middle East in general or the Israeli-Palestinian situation in particular. I say this in great frustration as someone who openly supported the Oslo Accords back when they were signed, and ever since then consistently until today backed the very idea of land for peace. But I've been, and the rest of Israelis of my sort, we were overruled and faced a joint venture of extremists from both the Palestinian and the Israeli sides, and that includes the current Palestinian leadership. Getting back to the previous discussion of what might happen despite Netanyahu's firm presence in the Israeli political landscape, I would say this. Israeli history has had, before Netanyahu, several very, very charismatic leaders. One was, of course, David Ben-Gurion, the founding father. Another was Menachem Begin, and a third was Ariel Sharon. They were very charismatic leaders. Each of them was followed by a very improbable replacement and a very anti-charismatic replacement. Ben-Gurion was followed by Levi Eshkol, who abroad is not at all remembered, but in Israel is recalled as one of the greatest leaders Israel ever had. He's the one who presided over the great military victory in 1967. Menachem Begin was followed by Yitzhak Shamir, who was totally anti-charismatic, but whose premiership was extremely effective and durable. Ariel Sharon was followed by the less impressive but also anti-charismatic Ehud Olmert. I therefore say that Netanyahu in all likelihood will also be followed whenever that moment comes by someone not nearly as charismatic as himself, and yet again that person might prove to be extremely efficient and a great surprise, although I don't know his name or her name right now.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Ruthie, let me ask you about this. Israel facing serious challenges, unemployment at double digits. You've got soaring housing prices. It's a major budget deficit, as you know. But the jokes have already started on social media. Here's one tweet. Israel literally will hold an election every few months to avoid going to therapy. Another, Israel is so proud of its democracy, it's going to hold an election every week. But the jokes actually point to a larger issue. You know, does the system work? Is there a need for reform? Should there be term limits? You know all these questions. What are the answers?
And I've really thought, I've been in Israel 43 years, and I come from the United States. So this system in general was peculiar to me, this parliamentary system. But even after I got used to it, I must say, at least in the earlier years that I was here in the 70s and early 80s, it was very clear that there were two blocks. You know, there was Likud and Labor, basically, and then the other more ideological to both sides parties. Today, you have a party for every, there are parties right now such as Labor and Meretz, that are indistinguishable. Okay, and you have many of those examples. It's like everyone with an idea has a party, and I think it's terrible. I think we definitely should have even a higher requirement for the electoral threshold, and term limits would be a good idea, definitely, because you know, the way the current system is, there aren't term limits because it's a parliamentary system and the head of a party. You actually elect a party, not a person. I would like to say one thing on behalf of Benny Gantz in reference to this discussion, and that is he was the head of the Blue and White Party, which wasn't really a party. It was a merger of a bunch of other parties. And yes, he came almost neck and neck with Netanyahu's Likud. And then, yes, he joined Netanyahu's coalition, even though he was the anti-Netanyahu party. Mm-hmm. But let's face it, the coronavirus had just hit. We realized at that moment that there was a global pandemic. And Benny Gantz did something that I think was responsible, and I think most of the public sort of was relieved that he did it, finally said, because he had no way of forming a coalition. And if Benny Gantz had not joined Netanyahu, we would have had another election back then. Yeah. So you could say that Gantz was doing the responsible thing as someone who hoped to become the leader after Netanyahu. And the fact that he was punished for it as soon as he joined Netanyahu's government, Yair Lapid, Yesh Atid, and others split from him. They abandoned him in anger. Okay. Now, Lapid's supporters say that's great, but Gantz deserves credit for having tried to prevent another election.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all of our panelists. Appreciate it. And that's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Mulder in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.